By the beginning of May 1954, the French position had become desperate. Weeks of continuous bombardment had reduced much of the fortress to shattered earth and broken concrete. Many bunkers had collapsed. Communication between strongpoints was almost impossible. Food was running out. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Thousands of wounded soldiers filled overcrowded aid stations, while doctors worked around the clock with fewer resources every day. The once powerful French fortress had been transformed into a battlefield of exhaustion. Still, the defenders refused to surrender. Many units fought with extraordinary courage despite overwhelming odds. Paratroopers, Foreign Legion soldiers, Moroccan troops, Algerian units, and Vietnamese soldiers serving with the French army continued defending every trench they could hold. But courage alone could not overcome the growing imbalance. The Viet Minh now controlled nearly every advantage. Their artillery dominated the battlefield. Their supply lines remained active. Their trench network reached the very edge of the remaining French positions. On May 1st, General Vo Nguyen Giap ordered the final offensive. Thousands of artillery shells crashed into the remaining strongpoints. Wave after wave of infantry advanced through the trench system that had taken months to build. The French defenders fought back fiercely. Machine guns fired until their barrels overheated. Mortars launched their last remaining ammunition. Small groups of soldiers defended isolated bunkers long after neighboring positions had fallen. But the pressure became impossible to resist. One by one, the remaining strongpoints disappeared. Command posts were overrun. Artillery batteries fell silent. Radio communications became increasingly chaotic. During the afternoon of May 7, the final defensive positions collapsed. French Commander General Christian de Castries sent his last messages from the command bunker as Viet Minh forces closed in. By evening, organized resistance had ended. After 56 days of relentless fighting, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was over. More than 10,000 French soldiers became prisoners of war. The defeat shocked France and stunned military observers around the world. Many experts had believed the French fortress could withstand any assault. Instead, it had become one of the greatest military defeats of the 20th century. But the significance of Dien Bien Phu reached far beyond the battlefield. Only weeks later, world leaders gathered at the Geneva Conference to negotiate the future of Indochina. The agreements that followed ended French colonial rule in the region. Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, pending future elections that ultimately never took place. The political consequences reshaped Southeast Asia and laid the foundation for the conflict that would later become known as the Vietnam War. Military academies around the world continue studying Dien Bien Phu today. The battle demonstrated that advanced weapons alone do not guarantee victory. Control of the terrain, secure logistics, accurate intelligence, adaptable leadership, and determination can outweigh superior technology. Perhaps the greatest lesson was the danger of underestimating an opponent. French commanders believed the mountains protected their fortress. Instead, those same mountains became the enemy's greatest weapon. They believed air power could sustain an isolated base indefinitely. Instead, anti-aircraft guns and artillery cut the fortress off from the outside world. They believed the Viet Minh lacked the resources to fight a prolonged conventional battle. Instead, they faced one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in military history. For General Vo Nguyen Giap, victory at Dien Bien Phu established his reputation as one of the most influential military commanders of the 20th century. For France, it marked the end of an era that had lasted nearly a century. And for the world, it proved that the outcome of war is not decided by weapons alone. Sometimes patience defeats speed, preparation defeats confidence, and determination changes history. More than 70 years later, the valley of Dien Bien Phu remains quiet. Yet the lessons learned there continue to shape military thinking across the world. The battle was not simply the story of one army defeating another. It was the moment an empire discovered that even the strongest fortress can fall when its assumptions are wrong. The opening assault shattered the confidence of the French defenders. The strong point known as Beatrice came under an intense bombardment, unlike anything the garrison had expected. Viet Minh artillery fired with remarkable accuracy. Command bunkers collapsed. Communication lines were cut. Within hours, many French officers had been killed, leaving units leaderless during the most critical moments of the battle. As darkness fell, waves of Viet Minh infantry advanced through trenches that had been dug ever closer to the French lines over the previous weeks. The defenders fought fiercely. Machine guns opened fire. Mortars exploded across the battlefield. Hand-to-hand combat erupted inside the trenches. But by the early hours of March 14th, Beatrice had fallen. The loss shocked the entire French command. Many officers had believed the outer defenses could withstand weeks of attacks. Instead, One of their strongest positions had disappeared in a single night. Only one day later, the next major position came under attack. Gabriel was hit by another devastating artillery barrage before thousands of Viet Minh troops advanced once again. French commanders attempted a counterattack using paratroopers and armored vehicles. Poor coordination, damaged communications, and relentless artillery fire prevented the relief force from reaching the defenders in time. By the morning of March 15th, Gabriel had also fallen. Within only a few days, the defensive ring protecting the fortress had already begun to collapse. The psychological impact was enormous. French soldiers had entered Dien Bien Phu, believing they occupied one of the strongest defensive positions in Asia. Now they watched surrounding hills filled with hidden enemy artillery that seemed impossible to silence. French guns answered with counter-battery fire, but many Viet Minh cannons had been carefully hidden inside reinforced caves. After firing several rounds, the artillery crews simply rolled their guns back under cover. French aircraft searched for targets, yet many positions remained invisible. Each passing day made the situation worse. The trench system surrounding the fortress continued expanding. Every night, Viet Minh engineers dug closer. Sometimes the trenches advanced only a few yards. Sometimes they reached the edge of French barbed wire before dawn. The defenders could actually hear digging in the darkness. By sunrise, new enemy positions had appeared again. French soldiers described the experience as watching the battlefield slowly close around them. Meanwhile, the airstrip became almost completely unusable. Artillery shells cratered the runway. Aircraft attempting to land were met by heavy anti-aircraft fire. Pilots increasingly refused to risk landing inside the valley. Everything depended on parachute supply drops. But even these became unreliable. Strong winds pushed containers away from friendly positions. Some landed directly inside Viet Minh lines. Others burst open on impact, scattering food, ammunition, and medical supplies across contested ground. The shortages quickly became severe. Ammunition had to be rationed. Medical stations overflowed with wounded soldiers. Doctors performed surgery with fewer supplies each day. Fresh water became harder to obtain under constant artillery fire. Simple movements between bunkers often meant risking death. Rain turned trenches into thick mud. Bodies could not always be recovered immediately. Exhaustion spread throughout the garrison. Despite these conditions, many French units continued fighting with extraordinary determination. Foreign Legion troops, North African soldiers, paratroopers, and colonial forces defended each position as long as possible. Counterattacks were launched again and again. Some temporarily regained lost ground. Most ended with heavy casualties. General Vo Nguyen Giap also faced difficult decisions. His forces suffered significant losses during the early assaults. Rather than continuing costly frontal attacks, he adjusted his strategy. Instead of rushing the fortress, he relied on constant pressure. The trenches moved closer. Artillery continued firing. Supply routes remained secure. The French defenders grew weaker while the Viet Minh strengthened their position. It became a battle of endurance. Every passing day favored the attackers. By April, the French fortress was no longer a unified defensive position. It had become a collection of isolated strong points struggling to support one another. The outcome of the battle was beginning to look increasingly inevitable. Yet the final assault had not even begun. General Vo Nguyen Giap understood one important truth. He could not defeat France by fighting on French terms. If he attacked the fortress in a direct assault, the Viet Minh would suffer devastating losses. Instead, he chose a strategy that demanded extraordinary patience. The first challenge was almost impossible. Heavy artillery had to reach the mountains surrounding Dien Bien Phu. French commanders believed this could never happen. Many of the roads simply did not exist. The terrain consisted of dense jungle, steep hills, deep valleys, and muddy trails that became nearly impassable after rain. Yet thousands of men and women began moving supplies through these mountains. Entire villages joined the effort. Civilians carried food, ammunition, medicine, and construction materials on their backs. Bicycles were reinforced with wooden supports and pushed under loads weighing hundreds of pounds. What had once been ordinary transportation became one of the most effective supply systems of the war. Even more astonishing was the movement of heavy artillery. Large guns weighing several tons were slowly dragged through forests using ropes, wooden rollers, and human strength. Sometimes hundreds of soldiers worked together to move a single cannon only a few hundred yards in one day. Every climb demanded enormous physical effort. Every mistake could send an artillery piece crashing down a mountain. Still, they continued. When the artillery finally reached the mountaintops, another challenge remained. The guns had to survive French air attacks. Instead of placing them in open positions, the Viet Minh carved firing positions directly into the hillsides. The The guns remained hidden inside caves and reinforced bunkers. After firing several rounds, they could quickly disappear behind layers of rock and camouflage before French aircraft could respond. French reconnaissance flights searched constantly, but many artillery positions remained almost invisible. At the same time, engineers built an enormous network of trenches. These were not simple defensive ditches. They formed an expanding system that slowly surrounded the French fortress. Every night, the trenches moved closer. French soldiers watched in disbelief as the enemy steadily advanced without exposing large numbers of troops. Whenever French forces launched counterattacks, they often found new trenches already waiting. The battlefield was changing one night at a time. Then came another surprise. The Viet Minh deployed anti-aircraft guns across the surrounding hills. French commanders had expected complete control of the skies. Instead, transport aircraft suddenly came under heavy fire during landing and supply missions. Pilots were forced to fly higher. Supplies became less accurate. Many parachutes drifted into Viet Minh-controlled territory. Some cargo was destroyed before it ever reached the French defenders. The airstrip soon became one of the most dangerous places in the valley. Shells repeatedly struck the runway. Aircraft attempting to land faced artillery fire from multiple directions. Eventually, regular landings became nearly impossible. Everything inside the fortress now depended on parachute drops. Food became scarce. Medical supplies ran low. Artillery ammunition was carefully rationed. Meanwhile, the Viet Minh supply system continued growing stronger. Every day brought more ammunition, more soldiers, more artillery shells. The balance of the battle was quietly shifting. French commanders slowly realized that they were no longer controlling the battlefield. Instead of trapping the Viet Minh, they themselves had become trapped. The fortress that was supposed to dominate the valley had become an isolated island, surrounded by an enemy growing stronger every single day. Then, on the evening of March 13, 1954, the waiting finally ended. The first massive artillery barrage erupted across the valley. French soldiers were stunned. Shell after shell crashed into command posts, artillery batteries, and defensive bunkers. Within hours, one of the strongest defensive positions, Beatrice, was under relentless attack. The battle that France had expected to win had begun, but almost nothing was unfolding according to the original plan. Everyone knows the name Dien Bien Phu, but very few people understand why this single battle changed the course of modern history. In just 56 days, one of Europe's most experienced colonial armies collapsed inside a valley it believed was impossible to conquer. France had tanks, artillery, aircraft, professional soldiers. Yet it was defeated by an army that many military experts had dismissed as poorly equipped guerrilla fighters. How could that happen? How did thousands of heavy cannons appear on mountains that French commanders believed were impossible to climb? Why did one of the strongest military powers in Europe willingly build a fortress in the middle of a valley surrounded by higher ground? And how did that decision end nearly 100 years of French colonial rule in Indochina? The Battle of Dien Bien Phu was not simply a military defeat. It became one of the greatest examples in history of how strategy, logistics, determination, and patience can overcome superior technology. To understand what happened, we have to go back several years before the first shot was fired. After World War II, France attempted to restore control over its colonies in Indochina. However, a powerful independence movement had already emerged, led by Ho Chi Minh and commanded militarily by General Vo Nguyen Giap. The Viet Minh gradually transformed from a resistance movement into a disciplined fighting force. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, the conflict became increasingly expensive for France. Despite receiving financial and military assistance from the United States, French forces struggled to destroy the Viet Minh. Instead of fighting large conventional battles, the Viet Minh relied on mobility, surprise, and knowledge of the terrain. French commanders became frustrated. They believed they needed one decisive battle that would destroy the enemy once and for all. In 1953, General Henri Navarre introduced an ambitious military strategy. His plan was simple: force the Viet Minh into fighting a conventional battle where French firepower and air support would guarantee victory. The location chosen for this decisive confrontation was a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam. It was called Dien Bien Phu. At first glance, the location appeared ideal. The valley sat near important supply routes leading toward neighboring Laos. French leaders believed that controlling this area would block Viet Minh operations across the region. More importantly, they believed the valley could become an enormous defensive fortress. French engineers quickly began transforming the area. Airfields were expanded. Hundreds of bunkers were built. Barbed wire surrounded defensive positions. Strongpoints received names such as Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, Dominique, Eliane, Claudine, and Isabelle. Thousands of elite French soldiers, including Foreign Legion troops and paratroopers, were flown into the valley. Artillery batteries were carefully positioned. Supplies arrived almost entirely by aircraft. French commanders felt confident. They believed the surrounding mountains were too steep for heavy artillery. According to their intelligence, the Viet Minh lacked both the equipment and transportation needed to move large cannons through dense jungle and rugged terrain. Without heavy artillery, French positions would dominate the battlefield. Aircraft could land safely. Fresh supplies would continue arriving. Any large Viet Minh attack would be crushed by superior firepower. On paper, the strategy looked almost perfect, but it rested on one dangerous assumption. It assumed the enemy would fight according to French expectations. That assumption would prove to be one of the greatest intelligence failures in modern military history. Unknown to French commanders, General Vo Nguyen Giap had already begun preparing something extraordinary. Instead of launching an immediate attack, he ordered tens of thousands of soldiers, engineers, laborers, and local civilians to begin one of the most remarkable logistical operations ever attempted in wartime. Over the following months, thousands of people disappeared into the surrounding mountains. The French saw very little. What they could not see would soon decide the fate of the entire battle.